Hi everyone, my name is Adil Hasan. I'm a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow in Melbourne, Australia. I hail from India. I wanted to begin by thanking the folks at the Center for Critical Legal Studies at Warwick for so kindly inviting me to give this talk and for organizing this wonderful seminar series for these times of pandemic. So Elan, Christine, and Anusha Misa, thank you. And I also wanted to thank you all in advance for those who will might end up eventually watching this or listening to this seminar. Thank you in advance for your time. And looking forward to possible conversations to follow. So yeah, without much further ado, the title for my paper is Receiving Traditions of Civility, Remaking Conditions of Cohabitation, a Genealogy of Politics, Law, and Piety. From December 2019 to March 2020, India witnessed widespread protests against the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the associated proposal to create a national register for citizens, on the grounds that these laws and policies fundamentally endangered the conditions supporting civic cohabitation in the country. These measures of the right-wing Hindu regime have been widely perceived to be a part of a larger project to eventually exclude various others, especially Muslims and Dalits, from the citizenry. These vibrant protests, only cut short by the pandemic-forced lockdown, were accompanied by various protest slogans, poetry, and chants, memorably including the public recitals of the preamble of the Constitution of India. Some of these protest practices drew the ire from certain quarters on the charges of being seditious, anti-national, anti-Hindu, extremists, and religious, anti-secular. In a thought-provoking piece, Rahul Rao of SOAS has suggested that the debates over the use of religious chants in these political protests have exposed a fault line in the dominant consensus that has existed in India regarding the contours of secularism. Following an analysis of some of the political debate that the chant elicited in the press, Rao critiques the narrow concepts of secularism that struggles with any expression of piety in the public sphere. He also contrasts this with practices of secularism on display in these very protests that do not merely tolerate religious difference, but exist precisely to enable the practice of piety by those who wish to practice it. Cross-religious solidarities or fraternity, Rao suggests, have the potential to contest ongoing right-wing projects of dismantling cohabitation in India. In this paper, I take Rao's instructive line of inquiry further by showing how the principles of secularism that Rao critiques forms a part of a larger project of modernity. I argue that in order to formulate an alternative project of enabling cohabitation, we must not only reappraise our concept of the secular, but also simultaneously reconceive the associated concepts of politics, law, and religion, and how they all relate to one another. This constellation of concepts all form interlinking parts of the transformational project of modernity. Here I I'm greatly relying on the work of the anthropologist Adil Hasan. So, one pivot around which this reconfiguration of religion and politics operates in modernity's project has been articulated by modern secularists, who, in the modern national state, sought to privatize religion by confining it to the autonomous forms of belief protected within the domain of the private sphere. Relatedly, in the colonial public sphere, modern secularists sought to construct religion as a marker of essentialized group identity on whose basis civic and limited political rights could be claimed. The other pivot gets articulated by modern anti secularists, who have sought to extend politicized religion's autonomous obligations into the public sphere. Pertinently, when it comes to the practices of the Hindu right in post colonial India, we are confronted with how these two modern modes of reconfiguring politics and religion get potently combined so as to facilitate the determination of the national public sphere by one set of religious norms and values, while simultaneously policing the appearance of any practices of other religious communities. In fact, as Ratna Kapoor shows, this paradoxical combination is achieved by construing secularism itself as representing a public norm uniquely supplied by a homogenized, and I might add, a monotheistic Hinduism, and its laudatory commitment to religious tolerance, while complementarily arguing for this doctrine to be interpreted as requiring the strict maintenance of formal equality in order to prevent any recognition of group rights or protection of the public expression of religious practices of other religious communities. As Ratna observes, the result is that the project of secularism becomes a project about assimilating religious minorities rather than about protection of the rights of religious minorities. For international legal scholars, the argument put forward here might initially, and I would add erroneously, resonate with recent critical treatments of the relationship between politics, international law, and religion. In these writings, the mainstream liberal narrative of a secular international law as the other of an irrational religion, one that enables the rational management and or overcoming of religious practices and religious identity within the public sphere, gets contested. What then follows is an anti-secularism that instead attempts to reveal how international law is essentially made up of, to quote Carl Schmitt, secularized theological concepts. A critique that ends up universalizing and anachronistically essentializing a particular conception of both international law and religion. By collapsing international law and religion into one another and suggesting a certain inescapable and ahistorical rigidity to this formation, these critical scholars end up positing a dialectical account of politics. For them, there is a juridical politics that is determined by the oppressively theological, and read here, Catholic international law, and a counter politics that is antinomian, messianic, and driven by the singular demands of an interior conscience that founds justice, read here, Protestant. This critical formulation leaves no room for a rival configuration of the relationship between politics, international law, and religion, whereby there might be a politics that is neither fully determined by religion and international law, nor entirely bereft of an ethic. In other words, it remains blinded to another international law that might assist in the cultivation of conditions of cohabitation. To search for alternatives, we must undertake an exercise in genealogy that unpacks the colonial histories of the project of modernity in India over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is these histories and their legacies in contemporary times that we must reckon with to illuminate alternative practices of living and struggling together. These alternative traditions are those of civility. Now, civility here refers to those historically conjoined arts of training selves and others, such as rhetoric, ritual, and jurisprudence, that seek to cultivate cohabitation. While the emergence of a project of modernity, or with the emergence of the project of modernity, the twin domains of these arts, the psyche and the polis, the soul and the polis, have been differentiated, with one considered to be the proper concern of the discipline of moral philosophy and aesthetics, wherein politics is a passionate contest of moral obligations, and the other of the social sciences, wherein politics is a rational calculus of interests. Here it is also instructive to keep in mind how colonial modernity's or colonial modernity's institution of a separation between law and ethics forms a part of this broader separation. I briefly describe certain traditions of civility practice in early modern Mughal India in the penultimate section of this paper before finally concluding. Now, a key event in the unleashing of the project of colonial modernity in India lay in the catastrophic aftermath of the failed revolt of 1857 against the colonial regime. This aftermath brought about the formal extinguishment of the Mughal Empire in North India, as well as intense colonial violence, especially against Muslim inhabitants of the capital city of Delhi, or Dilli as it was known, whom the colonial regime identified as the group most responsible for an uprising conceived as by them as having been an outcome of essentially religious grievances. While this was accompanied by renewed claims by colonial authorities that their successes stemmed from the superiority of their civilization, as Karuna Mantena has shown, it also marked, quote, a definitive turning point in the transformation of British imperial ideology, quote closed. A prior imperial policy assumed the eventual disappearance of the backward and corrupt traditions of the colonized in the face of a beneficial English civilization. This was now displaced with a rival imperial policy that advocated studying and managing these purported and recalcitrant beliefs and customs. This purportedly recalcitrant beliefs and customs, including by way of the technique of non interference and indirect rule, which partly relied on creating native religious authorities over the newly constructed realm of the personal. This response set the terms of the British Raj's colonial governance projects, as well as the native and nationalist participation in it, taking the form of a politics of interest. For politics in this mode, religious identity became the primary basis for both uh, the claiming and distribution of state violence, state protection, resources, employment, education, and over the course of time, limited representation in the government. In the wake of this crisis, many members of an emergent Muslim middle class intelligentsia felt a need to respond to a purported civilizational decline vis-a-vis the colonizing West through a reworking of the inherited Mughal Indo-Persian traditions. Investment in what got termed as religious revivalism was evidenced in what were otherwise seemingly contending heirs to the to the Mughal traditions. This included the modernizing liberal educational reformist Aligarh movement and the traditional revivalist Deoband school, which set up a madrasa in the city of Deoband, both in North India. Both Aligarh and Deoband, by effecting a division of labor, began construing religious education as being specialized and distinct from the training required for public life, thus revealing how this religious revivalism operated within the terms set by the colonial politics of interest. The college at Aligarh took up, which is where I studied, and it was my hometown, took up the task of providing modern Western education to elite Muslims to take up secular roles in the service of the colonial state and to participate in the colonial public sphere, for which they were in competition with members of other religious communities. The seminary or the madrasa at Deoband took up the task of training specialized religious scholars, teachers, and jurists who did not seek any association with the colonial public sphere and instead made this personal or civil sphere the proper domain for the application of this specialized religious knowledge. However, by the early 20th century, there also emerged an anti colonial, anti secular politics responding to this problematic of civilizational decline. This included Muslim theologians associated with Deoband committing to an anti colonial political solidarity with other Indian religious communities against the British regime. With the famous poet and London trained barrister Muhammad Iqbal and his influential reconceptualization of religion and its expansive role in politics, we have a rival anti colonial, anti secular politics being articulated. This significantly comes across in his 1930 Madras Lectures, later published as Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, a highly influential book in the 20th century and beyond, and his famous presidential address at the All India Muslim League annual conference in the same year. One is immediately struck by the affinities between Iqbal's Islam as religion and Reformation Protestantism, a parallel that Iqbal himself draws. Similarities include conceiving religion in terms of self-expression, of an authentic interior self of the believer and its personal responsibility to a transcendental God, one that did not require any intercession by way of ritual, spiritual guides, or institutions. For Iqbal, the extant Sufi orders and their mediative rituals acted as monastic orders and the Catholic Church had done to provoke the ire of the Protestant reformers. On account of their alleged enchanted, read superstitious, admixture of otherworldliness with life in this world. Religion, as he conceived it, was a distinct transcendental system to be kept pure of any immanent mediations. But as these universal truths or spirit, it also provided the grounds for inspiring an individual's conduct in all spheres of life. Thus, for Iqbal, religious piety takes the form of, and I quote here from a South Asian scholar, an Islamic version of the Protestant ethic, which ultimately emphasizes the immense personal responsibility of every individual to act as this transcendental God's representative on the earth, a Khalifa, on an earth which is disenchanted and plastic. Through their masterful actions, these divine representatives must create an Islamic polity that would successfully protect their religion in this world, while expressing an unshakable faith in their own personal salvation in the next. Assumed by this injunction is a reorganization of the relationship between religion and civilization that renders them to be coeval, with civilization or tehzeeb construed as the enduring, though something that requires defending, as enduring worldly achievements of imminent actions, Religious civilization, for example, Islamic civilization, is conceived as an actualization of this divine man's inherent power to act, create, and self express, which becomes a defining quality and achievement of an exclusive community, the Ummah, within an assumed world order. For Iqbal, this politics of self expression promised to overcome the perceived civilizational decline vis a vis the colonial Christian West, provided the original spirit of Islam could be revived, much like sort of the uh, sort of revivalist logic at work in Protestantism as well. Here, civilizational originality was strongly analogized with personal interiority and authenticity. Now, with the jurist and theologian Abul Kalam Azad, we find one of the most developed displays of the aforementioned and Deoband associated anti-secular, anti-colonial, anti-secular politics, which fundamentally contests this configuration of religious groups as essentially isolated and self-contained actors, both by Iqbal as well as those practicing a politics of interest. Here was an anti-secular politics wherein religious obligations were taken to primarily demand fraternity with other religious groups, with the telos of politics being sociability. Notably, Azad displayed a more optimistic spirit that, rather than anxiously obsessing on decline, evinced confidence in sociable creativity forming a major part of the Indian Muslim civilizational inheritance. These points come across in his address at the Bengal Provincial Khilafat Conference in 1920 and his acclaimed Urdu translation and commentary on sections of the Quran called the Tarjuman Quran that was published over 1930 to 1932. This variant of politics came to the fore with the launching of the All India Khilafat and non-cooperation movements in India in 1919-1920, with Azad as one of its chief ideologues. This inaugural mass movement of anti-colonial Indian nationalism espoused a pan-Islamic anti-imperial solidarity and grounded the Khilafat movement on the preservation of an explicitly religious symbol, the office of the Ottoman Sultan as the Amirul Mu'mineen, or commander of the faithful, and custodian of the sacred places of Islam. That is to say, Khilafat as an institution. This institution was perceived to be particularly threatened after the First World War on account of the moves made by British and Allied powers to dismember the Ottoman Empire. However, Azad's articulation of pan-Islamism was expressly linked with an anti-colonial nationalist solidarity between Hindus and Muslims in India. And Azad's speeches and writings had at their focus the creation of this plural national community. Meeting, living, and struggling together with other religious communities was expressly grounded by Azad in Quranic injunctions and narrated prophetic exemplum. He argued that Indian Muslims were bound by religious law to non-cooperation with the British and to cooperation with their Hindu allies, a community he deemed analogous to the Ummah Wahida that Muslims under Prophet Muhammad had formed with allied Jewish tribes in Medina by entering into a covenant, known as the Constitution of Medina by some. He further developed upon these ideas in the aftermath of the Khilafat movement in the Tarjuma. Now, the subsequent demise of the Khilafat movement with the abolition of the Caliphate by the Turkish Republic in 1924 did not end mass mobilization efforts by anti-colonial nationalist elites. When coupled with further colonial reforms in terms of allowing for greater participatory representation in provincial governments for nationalist parties, the overwhelming role of numerical strength in determining the outcomes of colonial politics of interest became ever more acute. For Muslims, such politics naturally raised the problem associated with their status as a minority, and the disadvantages this created in terms of engaging in formal representative rule. Iqbal and Azad again provided rival responses to this dilemma. Iqbal's solution through his politics of self-expression, premised upon self-contained individuals and religious communities, ultimately expressed a lack of faith in any possible future in which inter-community cohabitation did not descend into majoritarianism. As a minority very much divided across different possible fault lines, for example, of caste, class, language, and religious practices, the only way out of this conundrum was to achieve overarching pan-Islamic unity by way of successful vertical and horizontal mobilization. This is a mode of politics that seeks to achieve such mass mobilizing unity around this abstracting category of a supranational religious identity through an excitation of the passions which appeal to the personal responsibility of each individual to the cause of their isolated ummah. However, in order to achieve this, religion was sought to be stripped of all lived histories that illuminate distinctions, variations, and cross-pollinations, and forcibly melded into a homogeneous, disembedded, abstract national community, denying history and the claims of sociability. With Azad, both the minority problem and its solution were not formulated in such abstractive terms. He expressed an optimism in certain minority rights being duly protected in any future post-colonial state, suggesting a limited harking back to a politics of interest. However, this optimism, I would argue, in the possibilities of cross-denomination solidarity ultimately drew succor from the lived histories of cohabitation in India. In his effort to learn rather than abstract from these lived histories, Azad revealed that his politics was not entirely confined to the terms set in place by the project of modernity. It was to some of these other histories of traditions of cohabitation from Mughal India that I now briefly turn to in the penultimate section. So prominent amongst the arts associated with the traditions of civility in the Mughal Empire were that of Siyasi Akhlaq, or arts of political governance, and Sufi Adab, or arts of religious piety. Siyasi Akhlaq aimed to achieve a virtuous disposition for both the political governors and relatedly the polity. It was not achievable one was not achievable without the other, and both demanded a cultivation of states of moderation of extremes and a balancing of competing desires, chiefly associated with discerning the norms of justice or adl. Most significant here is the virtue of temperance or self-limitation, with non-observance of limits considered to be an attribute of the vice of tyranny. The primary manifestation of this virtue was to limit the chauvinistic glorification of one's religion, including through its compulsory propagation by the ruler, as this would imperil the balance and harmony required for the peaceful cohabitation of plural denominations. It's known as Sulekul, all of whom were assumed to subscribe to ultimately irreconcilable faiths. So there is not an assimilationist logic at work here. Such temperance is evocatively captured by the following didactic couplet penned by Nur al-Din Qazi al-Khani in his important early 17th century contribution to Akhlaq literature, the Akhlaq-e-Jahangiri. He writes, "Know that it is justice, not infidelity of faith, that ensures the safety of the country. For the world is better served by justice without faith than by the tyranny of a faithful king." Now, unlike the self-control associated with tolerance, secularism's principle for reckoning with religious difference, the virtue of self-limitation sought by Siyasi Akhlaq requires a more positive limit on the self. Temperance was further extended to relativizing the politico-ethical norms drawn from any single exemplary tradition. For example, the Quranic verses or Islamic prophetic exemplary conduct we saw with Azad. By instead eclectically drawing upon a plurality of exemplary precedents, including Indo-Persian traditions of kings and the Greek and Indo-Persian wisdom literature. Now, if self-limitation was a telos of siyasi akhlaq, then porosity and syncretism were keys features of Sufi adab. The Sufi adab practices of rituals, spiritual exercises, and everyday courtesies frequently drew upon other Indic religious practices and idioms of piety to achieve spiritual illumination and cultivate spiritual selves, and thus be considered to be truly civilized. This openness of Sufi practices of piety was itself enabled by the Sufi theological doctrine of Wahadatul Wujud, or unity of being, which emphasized the immanent presence of the divine in all existence and thus accommodated different interpretations of non-dualism underlying several Indic traditions of piety. Additionally, this piety of self-transformation was not one of ascetic renunciation, but put emphasis on virtuous everyday worldly conduct with cohabiting others as being essential to acquiring spiritual character. Contrary to Iqbal's negative characterization of this form of piety, this is not an otherworldly ethic, but a different way of being in this world with others. Instead of ethical practices of isolated divine representatives struggling to secure worldly success in order to protect their religion and to promote its glory, with faith in their personal salvation in the next world. Instead of this, Sufi adab entails worldly training undertaken by relational beings to achieve union with the divine, both in this world and in the next. It is my argument that both Siyasi Akhlaq and Sufi adab often complementarily train selves and others in the conduct and care of for what Genovese, Rush, and McVeigh call lawful relations, and were thus vital forms of jurisprudence associated with the traditions of civility. Now, to conclude, I'd like to say that religion, politics, and law are historical concepts, formed, modified, and related by diverse practices of reception and transmission, and not some universal, timeless categories. However, in rehistoricizing politics, law, and religion and their relationship, the aim of this genealogy has not been to neatly periodize these concepts and practices into before and after early modern, colonial, modern, post-colonial eras. Such an exercise would commit the error of treating colonial modernity as a period instead of being a project aimed at creating a particular form of life. Instead, our ongoing efforts to create traditions of civility today should be mindful of this redescriptive history. This historical illumination may allow us to be more receptive to alternative conceptions of meeting and struggling together with others, which belong to the rival project of civility. Traditions of civility, such as akhlaq and adab, while non-hegemonic in an age divided between secularism and anti-secularism, continue to be practiced by and associated with other forms of life. They require cultivation and learning from by more of us today, so as to enable the necessary conditions of cohabitation. For critical international legal scholars, this is a call to trouble the assumption that the other of a colonial international law can only ever be conceived in messianic and antinomian terms. We need to consider what international law of civility, what the international laws of civility are, and what modes and conditions of international cohabitation they enable. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion. Take care and stay safe.